Hi. It's me, Dr. KT, and welcome to ODDDUCK Science. Today, I want to go back in history. As we're talking about Black History Month, I want to recognize a small town in Warren County, North Carolina, and talk about how these group of individuals started the birthplace of environmental justice. Now, environmental justice is a term that we use to address the excessive burden of environmental pollutants that are experienced by marginalized communities. It is known that people of color tend to live in areas where there are high amounts of environmental pollutants. Sometimes we call these fence line communities. And again, fence line communities are areas where there are industrial factories, where there are chemical plants, or there are military bases. So essentially areas where there are a lot of chemicals that are hazardous to our health. Now you may be wondering, Dr. KT, why won't they just move? I'm glad that you asked that. I would recommend anyone, when you have the time, to read this book called The Color of Law. And what it talks about is the infrastructure that the United States set up to segregate housing amongst races. So what you see or what you find out in this book is that Black people, people of color, and other marginalized communities were only allowed to live in certain areas based on laws, based on policies that were written. Those communities sometimes were in fence line areas where there were chemical plants, where there were landfills, where there were industrial sites. And other times, places that were set aside for those marginalized communities, they did not have all of those chemical plants or those pollutants, but policy, legislation changed that. Which brings me back to the topic of today. In 1978, North Carolina's governor, Jim Hunt, announced that he was going to create this toxic landfill that was going to be an area where they could dump this toxic chemical that was cancer causing called PCB. And it stands for polychlorinated biphenyls. And so PCB, they were going to dump about 60,000 tons of this. Now, the concerning part, beyond that it was a cancer-causing chemical, that they were choosing this very rural community, and this community had some very interesting demographics. It was about 75% African-American. It was a very poor area, and it was an area where they did not have a mayor and they did not have a city council. Those things right there should give you a thought to pause. Now, what is so amazing about this community, I think, that gets overlooked, is that even though they were not represented, what they decided to do was to push back. They came together and they sought out legal representation as well as different scientists in the area and said, hey, we need to fight back. We don't want these chemicals in our area. We don't want this toxic land dump near our families, near our water supply. Like, our children are growing up here. Our families are growing up here. We've been here for quite some time. So they fought and they fought and they fought in the court system. Well, eventually the court system did not side with them. And so rather than giving up there, they took it to the streets. They began protesting. And this protesting went on for about 7 weeks. People would line up in the streets to block the trucks from coming in. There were all kinds of news media that was starting to come in and recognize that this small little area with these mighty people were pushing back against what the government was deciding to do. It caused so much controversy that the governor decided that after all of this protest and all of this negative media that North Carolina was getting, that he was going to detoxify this landfill as soon as he could. Now, saying all that, of course, it was not overturned, and about 7,000 truckloads of this waste was poured into this landfill. Now, I don't want us to get despondent and say, well, what's the purpose? We came together and nothing changed. Something did change, because what this did was create an echo into the world. This was the first time we started to see the impact of communities working together, reaching out beyond their neighbors and asking for help. This caused the government to not turn a blind eye. This was the first time that the EPA was going to have to look and see how these communities, marginalized communities, including Black communities and brown communities, were being affected by the placing of these environmental landfills that were full of toxic waste, or these different industries that were coming into the area and how they were polluting the air. This birthed environmental justice. What it did was create a global messaging to say, hey, this is something that everyone should be looking into, and it should be a fight that everyone can be a part of, regardless of color, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of race. There should not be anything that keeps us from saying that we deserve to be in an area, to live in an area where our health is not concerned about what's around us. And so let's take all of that and add the 3 Ds. And you can see I'm passionate about this topic. The first D, decode the science. What's going on? So in the late 1970s, we saw a cancer-causing chemical, PCB, was being dumped into a toxic landfill in a small rural county. Now, if you look at history before, we saw the summer before this all happened that this company was dumping it along the roadways of North Carolina, and it affected about 14 different counties, which makes you think, so why did they choose this county and not others? The second D, diversify. How does this affect me? It does affect you. It affects the community. It affected this entire community, because if we are dumping a toxic cancer causing chemical in the environment, that's going to affect generations. That's going to affect how we show up, how our health looks, and that affects the entire environment, because if it's leaching or leaking into our water system, into our soil, how is that going to affect our plants? How is it going to affect our food, our agriculture? And last but not least, dazzle. What was the thing that we were supposed to take home? Environmental justice is for everyone. It should not be a reason that because of skin color, because of socioeconomic status or gender, that anyone should have to consider whether their home is safe. It should be a right that we all should take in to be able to live somewhere safe and raise our children in a safe neighborhood. So I hope you learned something today. And remember, as always, science should be accessible and is accessible to everyone. Have a glorious day.